Hi, everybody. This is Jimmy, and you're reading with Jimmy. We're going to read a Greek myth today from Greek mythology, Daedalus and Icarus. This is from Ovid's Metamorphoses. Ovid was a famous Roman poet. So this is from book 8, Daedalus and Icarus. Pardon me. Meanwhile, Daedalus, hating Crete and his long exile, and filled with his desire to stand on his native soil, was imprisoned by waves. So Crete is an island, and Daedalus is on that island, and he's in prison, basically, because it's surrounded by water. He may thwart our escape by land or sea, he said, but the sky is surely open to us. We will go that way. Minos rules everything, but he does not rule the heavens. Minos was the ruler of Crete. And so saying, Daedalus applied his thought to new invention, and he altered the natural order of things. He laid down lines of feathers, beginning with the smallest, following the shorter with the longer ones, so that you might think that they had grown like that, on a slant. In that way, long ago, the rustic panpipes were graduated with lengthening reeds. Pan is the god, is one of the gods, panpipes. Pardon me. And then Daedalus fastened them together with thread at the middle and beeswax at the base. And when he had arranged them, he flexed each one into a gentle curve, so that they imitated a real bird's wings. His son, Icarus, stood next to him, and not realizing that he was handling things that would endanger him, he caught laughingly at the down that blew in the passing breeze, and softened the yellow beeswax with his thumb. And in his play, he hindered his father's marvelous work. Child playing, right? So when he had put the last touches to what he had begun, the artificer, that's Daedalus, balanced his own body between the two wings, and he hovered in the moving air. He instructed the boy as well, saying, "Let me warn you, Icarus, take the middle way, in case the moisture weighs down your wings. If you fly too low, or you go too high, the sun scorches them. Travel between the extremes. And I order you not to aim toward Boots, the herdsman, or Hellas, the great bear." He's giving him instructions on the constellations in the sky, or towards the drawn sword of Orion. Take the course that I show you. At the same time, as he laid down the rules of flight, Daedalus fitted the new created wings on the boy's shoulders, and while he worked and issued his warnings, the aging man's cheeks were wet with tears. The father's hands trembled. He gave a never-to-be-repeated kiss to his son. This is called foreshadowing, a never-to-be-repeated kiss to his son. So in foreshadowing, this is foretelling what's going to happen. So he's never going to be able to kiss. Something bad is going to happen. And lifting upwards on his wings, flew ahead, anxious for his companion, and like a bird leading her fledglings out of a nest above into the empty air. He urged the boy to follow, and he showed him the dangerous art of flying, moving his own wings, and then looking back at his son. Some angler catching fish with a quivering rod, or a shepherd leaning on his crook, or a plowman resting on his handles of his plow, they saw them, and stood there amazed, believing them to be gods able to travel in the sky. And now Samos, sacred to Juno, lay ahead to the left. So that's the country. Delos and Paros were behind them, so they had left already some countries. Levitos and Calmine, rich in honey, to the right. And when the boy began to delight in his daring flight and abandoning his guide, drawn by the desire for the heavens, he soared higher His nearness to the devouring sun softened the fragrant wax that held the wings, and the wax melted. He flailed with bare arms, but losing his oar-like wings, he couldn't ride the air. And even as his mouth was crying his father's name, it vanished into the dark blue sea. The Icarian Sea called after him. The unhappy father, now no longer a father, shouted, "Icarus, where are you? Which way should I be looking to see you? Icarus!" he called again. And then he caught sight of the feathers on the waves, and he cursed his inventions. He laid the body to rest in a tomb, and the island was named Icaria after his buried child. Wow. So let's have a discussion. This is a marvelous myth that is often used in allusions in literature. So allusion, you'll remember, it's a reference to a previous work or a name. And if you've been reading with Jimmy for a while, you see that in many of the classical pieces of literature that we read together, there are many, many allusions. And this is one of the allusions that potentially gets referred to. The story of Daedalus and Icarus, father and son, the son who flew too close to the sun and died. The story itself is about innovation, isn't it? It's about freedom. He wanted to escape from the island where he was trapped. Experience. He's a wise guy, right? He invented things. Youth and getting carried away in the moment. All of these things are in this beautifully written myth by Ovid. It's translated, of course. So there are many observations which can be made. For example, let's discuss some of them. Daedalus altered the natural order of things. What does that mean? Well, men were not made to fly. So by creating wings and acting like a bird, he altered the natural order of things. This is an important concept. Daedalus' invention changes nature. It's not natural for a man to fly, but his invention allows it to happen. So the question we have to ask ourselves from the myth is that should we alter the natural order of things? Should we change nature? He pays a high price for doing that, doesn't he? Doesn't he? Well, of course, he loses his son. But what else have we done as human beings to alter the natural order? We've been altering the natural order of things since we appeared on Earth, right? The dominant species. And now some of you are now going to say, well, that's why we've got climate change. Well, maybe not. Jimmy doesn't believe that necessarily because, for example, social media, I believe, is causing much more harm than climate change or what we're doing to the Earth. Not that we shouldn't respect the Earth. Of course we should. But there's a lot of hubris connected with the idea that you can alter nature, isn't it? Not that he had hubris. Daedalus didn't have hubris. He just wanted to get off the island. He wanted freedom. So he invented these wings and got his son to go with him, and his son lost himself in the moment and died. But altering the natural order of things happens every day. When you drive a car, you're not meant to drive at 70 miles an hour. You alter the natural order of things. Well, Jimmy, car is the natural order of things. No, it's not. Somebody invented vehicles, right? Henry Ford, the mass production of cars. The Wright brothers invented flying. They kind of had a plane like Daedalus, right? If you look at the early pictures of the Wright brothers, now we have jets. Now we have Boeing, who's also experiencing some design challenges. So altering the natural order of things is a concept in this myth and something to think about. Number two, not realizing that he was handling things that would endanger him. That's Icarus. And Icarus doesn't know because he doesn't have experience. Experience, ladies and gentlemen, experience. This is always the case of youth versus old, isn't it? The older you get, the more experience you have because you get experiences and you go through some perhaps trying experiences and you live to tell about it. So the more experiences you have, the more likely you are to have knowledge on what to avoid if you want to live longer. Don't touch poison ivy. If you don't know what poison ivy is, and you start just touching a bunch of plants, you may touch poison ivy, and then you're going to get a rash, a bad one. If you go too fast on the road and you lose control of your vehicle, that's not good either. That's why they have quote unquote speed limits. So this is always youth thinks they always know more and they know better because they're young and they don't have necessarily all the experience. On the other hand, if you have experience, you need new experiences, don't you? But in this case, he doesn't realize he's handling things that would endanger him. That's another foreshadowing, a kind of forewarning. Do you have examples from this from your own life? Do you have examples when Jimmy was a young man and he had a stove at home? He would turn the stove on and my mother would tell him, "Don't touch that, Jimmy." And Jimmy said, "Why not?" Because I said so. You're going to hurt yourself. Of course, I didn't listen until I burned myself, and then I never played with the stove again. So sometimes you have to experience something in order to avoid it. You don't listen to your elders, your parents, the more experienced people. On the other hand, sometimes people are too cautious with experience, and some things you just have to learn yourself, right? Learning to drive is one. You can listen to all the instructions yourself that you want, but eventually, once you get behind that wheel, you're going to have to take the chance. You're going to have to take the shot. So, in his playfulness, Icarus hinders his father's work. He touches the wax. He plays with the wax. He doesn't know what his father's trying to do. Another good concept, right? Number 3. Instructed the boy as well, saying, "Let me warn you, Icarus, to take the middle way, in case the moisture weighs down your wings from the ocean. If you fly too low, or if you fly too high, the sun will scorch them. Travel between the extremes, between the ocean and the sun, between the extremes." This is a very important concept. It's the middle way. It's the golden mean. It's what Aristotle talked about. And if you read with Jimmy, you'll hear Jimmy talking about Aristotle every now and then. In fact, a lot. Why? Because Aristotle was one smart cookie. Classical scholar. And he used to teach about the middle, the golden mean, the middle. Moral behavior, he said, is the mean between two extremes, One is excess and the other is deficiency. So one is too much and one is not enough. So finding a moderate position, let's be moderate between the extremes, you will be acting morally. The Nicomachean ethics is where Aristotle discusses this, and I took a chapter 9, a little bit of it. The moral virtue is the mean state, and that lies between two faulty states. One is excess and the other is defect. And that is so because it has an aptitude to aim the mean, the middle, both in feelings and actions. And all this has been set forth fully and sufficiently. It's a big, thick book. You should read it if you get the time. We're not going to read the whole thing here. I'm just pulling a piece of it to show you what we're talking about, which is what Daedalus is giving Icarus advice on. Stay in the middle. Don't go too close to the ocean so the moisture melts the wings. Too close to the sun so it melts the wings. And so it is hard to be good. It's hard to be good. Isn't that the truth? It's hard to be good. For surely hard is in each instance to find the mean, and just to find the mean point and center of a circle is not what any man can do, but only he who knows how to do that. Just so to be angry, to give money, to be expensive is what any man can do, and it's easy to do. It's easy to get mad. It's easy to give money, to be, how to do these things to the right person and do proportion at the right time with the right object and in the right manner. This is not, as before, what any man can do, and it's not easy. Balance, right? Balance, middle. And for this cause, goodness is rare and praiseworthy and noble. So even Aristotle noted in his time that goodness is rare. Finding the right time to do things in proportion is very rare. Therefore, he who aims at the mean should make it his first care to keep away from the extremes, which is more contrary to the mean, as Calypso in Homer advises Ulysses. So Calypso was a nymph in Homer's version of Ulysses or the Odyssey, and we will read that at Reading with Jimmy. Clear of this smoke and surge thy banquet direct. Because of the two extremes, one is always more, the other less, erroneous, and therefore, since to hit exactly on the mean, the middle, to hit the middle of anything is difficult. So one must take the least of the evils as the safest plan, and this a man will be doing if he follows this method. In other words, if you think about an extreme, is really the extreme of anger or the deficient of anger, of never being angry, right? We can look and find somewhere in the middle where there's a point where it's okay to be angry, but not too angry and not too not angry, right? Too calm, right? Although, you're trying to control your anger all the time if you're under fire, right? So if you think of anything, possession of wealth, money, too much money is no good, too little money is no good. You just got to find the right amount, whatever that is. So Aristotle taught the golden mean. Try to be moderate. Try to stay in the middle. That's the best way to do it. There's a problem with that. It's not one of the problems we saw here with Icarus is that he got involved in flying. In the act of flying, he forgot to stay in the middle and he died. So that's what happens actually if you go to extremes sometimes. So Daedalus gave him great advice, stay in the middle. And we're going to talk about this in a moment more. The boy began to delight in his daring flight, abandoning his guide, drawn by the desire for the heavens. He soared higher. So he didn't go towards the ocean. He got carried away with, this is unbelievable. If you remember your first airplane flight, Jimmy remembers his. It was to Miami. Jimmy didn't, it was a long time before Jimmy got on a plane. When he did get on a plane, it was for work, go down to write a script in Miami for a client. And he still remembers his first flight. It was unbelievable. Unbelievable. Much more appreciative than when you're 7 years old or 10 years old. You're still appreciative, but not as appreciative as when you're an adult flying. And when you lose yourself in something, danger can arise. Would you agree with that? I think you can agree with that. If you eat too much, drink too much, right? So concentration, focus, to stay in the middle, these are important concepts. If you lose control of yourself, chances are something bad is going to happen. Well, Jimmy, I don't believe that. Well, you don't have to believe that. What we want to learn is what this mythology, this story of Daedalus and Icarus teach us, which is really a story about the golden mean, stay in the middle. And then he cursed his inventions, and you've heard of the saying, be careful what you wish for. So the father, after his son died, he cursed his inventions. Don't forget, his invention did alter nature. I'm sure if you've seen some of the things about social media, the creation of social media, some of those let's say, testimonials and the stories about the social media invention, some of those people regret what they did in unleashing this power. Um, if Oppenheimer was a good movie recently that talked about Oppenheimer, who created, who actually brought together and tested the first atomic bomb, he regretted. Einstein, E equals MC squared guy, he too had second thoughts about his quote unquote invention. So, what are some of the inventions that have altered nature? The internet altered nature, vehicles altered nature, airplane. Everything man invents alters. It's because it's not really natural, is it? So, do some inventions have unintended consequences, like Daedalus did? Daedalus's invention of wings to fly had unintended consequences. It killed his son. So now he's got to live with that the rest of his life. But there's other inventions that happen that have unintended consequences. You think you're doing the right thing, but then it turns out to be a bad thing, right? So you have to just be careful. There's a poem called Andrea del Sarto by a guy by the name of Robert Browning, and you can look it up and read it. It has this line in it. But what's a man's reach? But a man's reach should exceed his grasp. Or what's a heaven for? Think about that. A man's reach, your reach, should exceed your grasp. Or what's a heaven for? So there's a case in this poem where he's saying, you got to go for it. Or what's a heaven for, right? I mean, you got to try it. And Icarus tried it, and he lost his life because he didn't stay in the middle. If he stayed in the middle, he, like his father, he would have made it, right? But he didn't. So should a man's reach exceed his grasp? A man is used here in the universal sense. It's not used as a man or a woman. It's used in the universe. Should our reach exceed our grasp? Or else what's heaven for? No pain, no gain, remain the same. You've heard that, right? So and there's another famous English poet called William Blake, and he said this in his work called The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. You never know what's enough unless you know what's more than enough. So in the case of Icarus, he didn't know how close he can come to the sun unless he found out the hard way that it was too close. Is that the rule we should follow? Should we always be testing ourselves? Oh, I can lift this weight. I can lift. Oh, I pulled my pectoral muscle, or whatever. Right? Is that what you should be doing? I don't think so. But on the other hand, you don't want too light of a weight if you're weightlifting, and you kind of want in the middle, right? But what he says is true. You cannot deny the truth of these things. You never know what's enough until you know what's more than enough. I've had enough. Well, how do you know that unless you know what's more than enough, right? When I was running my business and still run my business, I used to ask, what's enough money? How much money do you really need? And I used to have a great guy that worked for me in the shipping department. He says, I'll let you know when it's enough. Oh, gosh. We can talk about that another time. Anyway, both quotes are interesting in relationship to this story of Daedalus and Icarus because they discuss what happens when you go to extremes. The difficulty is that you really can't know the mean, the middle, unless you have those extremes. You have to have an idea of the extremes. The question is, how far do you push it? You are liable, like Icarus, to break things if you forget yourself in the moment of joy. But then how do you experience real joy, which is kind of an abandonment? True joy is like, oh my God, it's great, right? Unless you abandon yourself, give yourself up. So these are difficult questions, aren't they? Who would have thought that a myth about Daedalus and Icarus would give us these questions? But one thing's for sure, we should listen to the people who have experience. I used to say, my father used to tell me, I know better than you. Stay away from that guy. He's no good for you. You don't hang around that guy. He's going to have a bad influence on you. Of course, I didn't listen to him, and the result was the bad influence. But then his words would ring in my ears when I would hang around my friend. And that's what people do. Theoretically, older people they know more because they've been around more, they've lived longer, they've experienced more. And if we ignore their experience or advice, I'm not saying you have to listen to everything you're told. I'm saying that if you ignore the advice or experience of an older person, you take a chance. And the question is, how many chances, how much risk can you endure? Don't cross the street except at the crosswalks. Don't jaywalk. Okay, so there may be advice from somebody told you not to do it, and yet you do it. And then you see people who get hit jaywalking or something like that. Jimmy's wife had a severe accident, even though she was walking in the lines where you should be walking. She got in an accident. So even though you follow the rules, sometimes accidents happen. This was just a stupid driver. And she's all right. Thanks for asking. In any case, this was many years ago. If you don't listen to people who have more experience than you do yourself a disservice and you take perhaps an unnecessary risk. I'm not saying to ignore it. I'm not saying to obey it. I'm saying you owe it to yourself to listen. Icarus did not listen to Daedalus, did he? He may have listened, but then he forgot when he was flying and enjoying the experience of flight, which hitherto had not been experienced by these people in this myth, because they were mistakenly thought of as gods by the people on the earth. He didn't listen to him, and he got caught up in the joy of the moment. So I'm not saying don't ignore getting caught up in the joy of the moment. I'm saying that when you're doing something that's altering nature, you know what I'm talking about, ladies and gentlemen? When you take in things into your nature that alters your nature, you better be careful. Just better be careful. Because you won't always be lucky, and it won't always turn out good, and all you need is one time for things to turn out bad. Icarus needed only one time to lose himself to the joy of flying and not remembering what his father told him. I'm just saying. So experiences help guide us from making what could be serious mistakes. You're going to make enough mistakes in your life. I still make mistakes every day, but I try not to make my mistakes fatal. You don't want to make a fatal mistake, right? I was cutting a piece of, not candy, but dessert that my wife made, and I licked the knife. I'm an old guy. Just as I started to lick it, I realized, don't lick that knife. Of course, it was too late, but I recovered quickly enough so that it was only a little nick in my lip, which took a couple of days to heal because I'm a crybaby, But if I didn't remember, because I had just sharpened the knives, and they were very sharp, ladies and gentlemen. So don't lick the knife after you cut into something good is a very good rule. Well, Jimmy, I've done it many times. That's great. I have too, but all it takes is one lick of that knife, and that's not a good thing. All right. Finally, so just listen to people with experience. I didn't say obey. Remember, that's up to you. Finally, in another book, this is not classic literature, by Gene Kranz, called Failure is Not an Option. Failure is Not an Option. It's a very good book. It's not a classic. We will not be reading that book on this website because it's not classic literature. It's just a very good book. Gene Kranz, if you don't know who he is, he was the head of flight control that brought back that Apollo mission of those astronauts who almost did not come back. It's an excellent book if you're interested in outer space, and also it has many, many, many life lessons. So in that book, Gene Kranz is describing when he first started working at flight control in the early days of the Mercury flights. He was in a group and they were dealing with a situation that they had never faced before. And the nature of dealing in flight control and actually in anything, you're always going to be faced in situations that you've never faced before. Okay, that just like Icarus and Daedalus, these people never flew, so they were dealing with a situation they never faced before. The father tried to give him his experience since he built the wings, right? So in this story, in this book, Failure's Not an Option, the situation was that a rocket that should have launched off the pad did not launch. The rockets went off, but it didn't leave the launch pad. And it acted, sorry about that. Let me shut this off, ladies and gentlemen. I apologize. And it didn't go off the pad. It was sitting there, and it acted as if it were in the recovery phase of the mission, this rocket. And while it's sitting on the pad, it deployed the parachutes. Think about that. So the rocket fires. It lifts off just a little bit, comes back down, sits on the pad, and the rocket thinks it's already launched and it's deploying its parachutes. So they now have a live rocket on the pad with all the fuel on the pad that was going to take this rocket into outer space. And we had no control over it. There was no control over that rocket anymore. The booster's destruct system was armed, and there was no way to secure the system. Destruct system, right? So they couldn't get close to it to disarm it. It's sitting there with all of this stuff, fuel. Just the parachutes are out. Of course, there's no wind. They check the weather, and there's no wind, right? No one had any idea what to do. Did you ever get in a situation like that where you had no idea what to do? So in this case, in the case of the myth we read, right, Daedalus told his son, don't fly too high, too low, stay in the middle, stay in the mean. But in this case, they're faced with a situation where that doesn't apply. They're facing a very, very dangerous situation. So once they formulated a plan after intense discussion, the boss, Kraft was his boss. This guy was his boss. And if you read the book, they have an intense discussion. Kraft is yelling. There's a guy from Germany yelling in German. It's chaos. It's chaos. So they finally talk. Kraft listens and they formulate a plan to let the batteries run out overnight, and then the rocket would shut down. Isn't that a great plan? Just let the battery. Of course, they have to check the weather maps repeatedly because they don't want any wind taking those parachutes, opening them up and tilting that rocket. Very dangerous, right? The line I want you to remember is this. Kraft's Gene's boss nodded and growled at his controllers. So he's growling at them because they were, before this discussion, they were going to be doing all sorts of things. They were thinking about it. They were going to execute this, that, these other solutions. And he yells at them and he says, that's the first rule of flight control. If you don't know what to do, don't do anything. And why does he tell him that? Because if you do the wrong thing, you're going to kill somebody or many people. You don't know. If you don't know what to do, don't do anything. Sometimes that works, sometimes that don't. If you're in harm's way and you don't know what to do, you better do something if you are indeed in harm's way. If you don't know how to swim and you're drowning, worst thing you can do is try to do something, right? You panic and then you drown. So sometimes it's better to remain calm and think things through. That's what warriors do, right? They think things through and they learn how to overcome their panic. And these people, when you read this book, were panicking. Just like Icarus was panicking when he realized that things melting and he couldn't, there he goes. He plunges into the ocean. Because he forgot. He just forgot what his father told him. Life's lessons are ongoing, and if we avoid tragedy by learning from others, isn't that what we should consider? Shouldn't you consider that? If someone, like a rule like this, if you don't know what to do, don't do anything. I made many mistakes trying to do something when I don't know what to do, and sometimes I'd screw up the project. But then as you practice, when you practice facing situation, this is a situation right here. No one had any idea what to do next. The more you practice, the more you know what to do next. Should I repeat that? The more you practice doing things, the more you'll know what to do next. Many people in business, you face situations you couldn't possibly contemplate. And so you seek the advice of others. When I was in business and sued for being a preferred vendor by a major corporation that went bankrupt, I didn't know what to do. They're suing me for all this money that theoretically I paid as a preferred vendor. I didn't know what the hell that meant. So you turn to attorneys. That's when I learned that in business you need lawyers. I was a rookie. I didn't know. And I found the greatest bankruptcy attorney you can think of through networking, right? And Gene told me, he says, let me see your books. He saw my books. He says, you have nothing to worry about. This is done all the time when people go bankrupt. They sue the people that owe them money and that they paid money to, and they sue the people that they paid money to as preferred vendors. I said, but I'm not a preferred vendor. And he said, it doesn't matter. What do you mean it doesn't matter? Well, it doesn't matter because that's what happens in bankruptcy, in bankruptcies. I learned more than I ever want to know about bankruptcies through that experience. So that if it ever happened again, and it didn't, I would not only know what to do, I would know how to do it. If you don't go through that experience and suddenly you're being sued, this is my first lawsuit in business for lots and lots of money because I did lots and lots of business with this company. I'm going, what the hell is this all about? So we settled for a fraction of what they paid me. But nevertheless, it was a fraction, but it was still a lot of money. And when I asked Gene, I said, well, when this was all over and it was settled, I said, now can I sue them? And Gene goes, how much money do you have? I go, what do you mean? He says, you can sue anybody for anything. Depends how much money you have, because what's your objective? I said, well, I want my money back that I just gave him. He says, it's a long road if you're going to do that. So, you bite the bullet and you learn from experience. And these things happen. When the big major company went bankrupt, these things happen. Companies go bankrupt. It's the risk you take. In business, you take risks. In life, you take risks. The object of life is to minimize risk. And you minimize risk by learning from people with experience. That's all I'm telling you. And this myth, that's what these myths are for. They're here, these myths were created to tell stories, to teach people about life. about life. Not just because they're nice stories, not because they're entertaining, but it's about life. This Daedalus and Icarus story is about life. It's about older people giving young people advice and enjoying life, but also trying to stay in the middle. Don't go to too much extreme. Because you may get lucky. He could have got lucky and survived going close to the sun, but he didn't. You could get lucky going 100 miles an hour on an empty road, but maybe you don't. So the thing is to always keep that in mind. There's always the other side of the argument. This is what you should, there must be some things that you have to experience for yourself. I could have read everything I wanted about bankruptcy. I could have. And I knew what bankruptcy was, but I didn't know the rules of bankruptcy until I experienced it. And it cost me a lot of money. Cost my company a lot of money. Could have been worse if I didn't have the right advisor. The right advisor is absolutely essential. And one of the right advisors of all of our lives are the older people around us. Because you can't live that long sometimes without going through experiences that help you. I had a good friend who passed away who was 10 years older than me. And I would always turn to him for advice. I didn't take it all the time, but he always had excellent advice. Now, why didn't you take it, Jimmy, if it was so excellent? Well, because my situation was perhaps different. And I'd never ignored the advice. I just didn't obey it all the time. And most of the time, because he was a businessman like myself, it coincided and it was very close to my own decision on what to do. But you still never know. You got to take the shot. You got to take the shot. You've been reading with Jimmy. This was a myth. Daedalus and Icarus. Daedalus and Icarus. Learn more about classical mythology by watching more on ongoing videos in mythology in the mythology section of this website. And be sure to visit and read other classic literature, novels, short stories, dramas. Any questions? Email me, Jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com. Jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com. Thanks so much for listening. Remember, the golden mean, don't get too close to the sun, ladies and gentlemen. Just be careful. On the other hand, no, I'm not going to say it. You never know what's enough until you know it's more than enough. Just take care of yourselves. You only have one life to live.